The wind in the Montana Territory didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a jagged, bone-deep cold that turned breath into ice and hope into ash. Inside the Copper King trading post, the air was a foul stew of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of desperation. Elara Vance stood in the center of it all, her fingers numbly clutching the leather satchel hidden beneath her tattered shawl. She was a ghost in a room full of wolves. Behind her, Miller, a man with a heart as black as the coal he mined, gripped her shoulder with a hand that felt like a shackle. "Look at her," Miller hollered, his voice echoing off the timber beams. "Clean teeth, young, and works like a mule. Her father died owing the company a debt that's got to be paid in blood or silver. $50 clears her. Who wants a girl to keep the winter out of their bones?" Laughter erupted, coarse and cruel. Elara didn't flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on a knot in the floorboards, her jaw set so tight it ached. She was waiting for the right moment to pull the small, jagged piece of glass hidden in her pocket. She wouldn't be kept. She'd die in the snow first. Then the heavy oak door groaned open. A wall of frost swirled into the room, and with it came a man who looked like he had been carved out of the mountain itself. He was massive, easily a head taller than any man in the room, shoulders broad enough to block out the light. He was draped in a heavy bearskin coat, his face obscured by a thick dark beard and a hat pulled low. This was Silas Sterling, the Wolf of the Peaks. The room fell silent. Silas didn't look at the bar. He didn't look at the fire. His eyes, the color of a stormy winter sea, locked onto Elara's. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. There was a raw, primal recognition in his gaze that made Elara's breath hitch in her throat. Silas walked forward, his heavy boots thudding like a funeral drum. He stopped 3 feet from Elara. The heat radiating off him was a physical force, clashing with the drafty air of the post.
"Can I buy you?" His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, vibrating rumble that she felt in the soles of her feet. It was the sound of shifting tectonic plates. Elara lifted her chin. She saw the scars on his hands, the hands of a man who knew how to kill and how to survive. She leaned in, her voice a sharp, dangerous whisper. "You can pay the man, stranger, but don't mistake a transaction for ownership. If you touch me without my leave, you'll find out why they call the mountains a graveyard." A flicker of something, amusement, hunger, passed through Silas's dark eyes. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy velvet pouch. He didn't hand it to Miller. He dropped it on the floor at the man's feet. "Take it," Silas growled, never breaking eye contact with Elara. "And if any of you follow us, make sure you've said your prayers. I don't bury what I kill." The cabin on the edge of the world. The ride up the mountain was a blur of white-knuckled terror and strange, blooming heat. Elara sat in front of Silas on his massive stallion. Because the trail was narrow and the wind was fierce, he had been forced to pull her back against his chest. She had never felt anything like him. He was solid as oak, his heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm against her spine. Every time the horse stumbled, his thick arms tightened around her waist, his gloved hands dwarfing her frame. The scent of him, leather, pine resin, and a clean, masculine musk was intoxicating, filling her head until she felt dizzy. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun had dipped below the peaks, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple. Inside, the cabin was small, intimate, and smelled of cedar. Silas moved with a surprising, predatory grace, lighting a fire that roared to life in seconds. Elara stood by the door, her heart hammering. "Take off the wet clothes," Silas commanded, his back to her as he stoked the flames. "I will do no such thing," she snapped, though her teeth were chattering. Silas turned. He began to unbutton his own heavy tunic, revealing the bronze skin of his throat and the dark hair of his chest. The firelight played over his muscles, casting long, dancing shadows. He stepped toward her, and this time Elara couldn't move. He trapped her against the door, one hand resting on the wood beside her head.
"Listen to me, little bird," he rasped, his voice dropping to a velvet low that made her skin prickle. "You're shivering so hard you're liable to break. There is one bed, one fire, and a storm outside that will kill you in 10 minutes. I've paid 50 gold pieces to keep you alive, and I'm a man who likes to get his money's worth." He reached out, his thumb grazing her jawline. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was so unexpectedly gentle that Elara felt a sob rise in her throat. "I don't want your secrets yet," he whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips, "and I won't take what isn't given, but you will get warm." He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. The tension between them was a wire stretched to the breaking point. Elara could feel the heat of his breath, see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. For a second, she wanted to lean into him, to let this giant of a man carry the weight of the world she'd been dragging alone. "Strip," he whispered, "or I'll do it for you." The fire crackled, the only sound in the suffocating silence of the cabin. Outside, the blizzard screamed like a jilted lover, but inside, the air was heavy with a different kind of storm. Elara sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her damp hair clinging to her neck. Silas sat across from her, his massive frame hunched as he cleaned a heavy Colt revolver with practiced, lethal movements. The flickering orange light caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look like a god of the wilderness, beautiful and terrifying all at once. "The men back at the post," Silas said, his voice a low vibration in the small room. "They weren't just looking for a debt, they were looking for a kill. What's in the bag, Elara?" Elara hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for the leather satchel. She pulled out a bundle of oilcloth-wrapped papers and laid them on the rough-hewn table. "My father was the head surveyor for the mining syndicate," she began, her voice steadying. "He found something they didn't want the world to know. They aren't just mining coal, Silas. They're poisoning the water table of every settlement from here to the border to force the settlers off their land. They want the whole territory." She unfolded a map, her fingers brushing against Silas's as she pointed to a marked location. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat that made her breath hitch. Silas didn't pull away. His hand stayed there, covering hers, his skin dark and rough against her pale, shaking fingers. "These are the locations of the secret veins they've been tapping," she whispered. "And this," she pulled out a ledger, "is the list of every judge and marshal they've bought, including the man who sent you into hiding 10 years ago." Silas froze. He looked from the ledger to Elara, his eyes darkening with a predatory intensity. He stood up, his sheer height casting a shadow that swallowed her. He moved around the table, his presence so overwhelming that Elara felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He stopped inches from her, his hands gripping the edge of the table on either side of her, pinning her in place. The scent of wood smoke and raw masculinity was dizzying. "You realize what this means," he rasped, his face so close she could see the golden rings around his pupils. "If we keep these papers, there is no going back. I'll have to burn every bridge I've built to stay hidden. I'll have to kill men who have names and families." Elara looked up at him, her fear melting into a fierce, burning defiance. "I'm not asking you to hide me anymore, Silas. I'm asking you to fight with me." Silas's gaze dropped to her mouth, his breath warm against her skin. The buy and sell of the trading post was gone, replaced by a raw, undeniable hunger. He reached out, his large hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind her ear. "I didn't buy you for the papers, Elara," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden aching passion. "And I didn't buy you for your silence." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The tension was a living thing between them, pulling them together like gravity. "I think I bought you because I knew the moment I saw you that you were the only thing in this world worth dying for." His hand tightened in her hair, pulling her head back just enough to look into her eyes. The firelight danced in the reflection of his gaze, a silent promise of the war and the heat that was yet to come. The storm outside peaked, a banshee wail that shook the heavy timber walls of the cabin, but the silence inside was louder. It was a silence charged with the weight of everything they hadn't said and everything they were beginning to feel. Silas didn't move. He remained hovered over Elara, his thumb still tracing that delicate line behind her ear. The heat from the hearth was at their backs, but the real fire was the friction between them. "You should sleep," Silas rasped, though he made no move to let her go. "The sofa is narrow. Take the bed. I'll stay by the fire." Elara looked up at him, her pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. The wolf was supposed to be a monster, a man of stone and ice, but his touch was trembling. He wasn't a beast. He was a man who had been starved of light for too long. "And leave you to freeze on the floor?" she whispered, her voice braver than she felt. "The bed is large enough, Silas, and the night is too cold for pride." Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle leapt in his cheek. He knew what she was offering, not just a space to sleep, but a surrender of the walls he'd built around his heart. Slowly he stepped back, giving her air. But his eyes never left hers. Hours later, the cabin was draped in deep velvet shadows. The fire had settled into a low, rhythmic glow of dying embers. Elara lay beneath the heavy furs, her eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. Beside her, Silas was a mountain of heat. He lay on top of the blankets, still dressed in his trousers and Henley, his arms folded behind his head. He was trying to be a statue, trying not to breathe too deeply, but the scent of her, lilacs and rain, was filling his lungs. "You're awake," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the mattress and settle in her bones. "I can't stop thinking about the men," she admitted, turning onto her side to face him. The moonlight through the frost-rimmed window caught the silver in his hair. "What they'll do when they find us." Silas turned his head. In the dark, his eyes were predatory, intense. He reached out, his large hand finding hers beneath the furs. He didn't just hold it, he laced his fingers through hers, his calluses catching against her soft skin. "They have to get through me first," he said, "and I've been waiting a long time for a reason to stop hiding." He pulled her hand up, his gaze never wavering, and pressed a slow, lingering kiss to her knuckles. It wasn't the kiss of a stranger who had bought her, it was the vow of a protector. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Elara felt a surge of longing so sharp it hurt. She moved before she could talk herself out of it, sliding across the space between them until her forehead rested against his shoulder. Silas let out a jagged breath, his arm instinctively wrapping around her, hauling her flush against his side. The contact was a shock to the system. She was so small against him, so fragile, yet she held a fire that dwarfed his own. "Elara," he warned, his voice thick with a sudden raw hunger. "I am not a good man. I've lived in the dark for so long I've forgotten how to be gentle." "Then don't be gentle," she whispered, her hand sliding up his chest, feeling the frantic, heavy thud of his heart. "Just be mine." He groaned, a low, primal sound, and finally closed the distance. His mouth met hers, not with a question, but with an explosion of years of loneliness and sudden, violent need. It tasted of salt, fire, and the desperate hope of two people who knew they might not see the sunrise. His hands, huge and sure, framed her face, his fingers tangling in her hair as he deepened the kiss, claiming her with a ferocity that left her breathless. In that small cabin, buried under 10 feet of Montana snow, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the heat, the scent of cedar, and the man who would burn the world down to keep her warm. The storm finally broke at dawn, leaving the world wrapped in a deafening, crystalline silence. The cabin, once a sanctuary of shadows and heat, was now a fortress on the edge of a precipice. Silas stood by the window, his rifle leaned against the wall, watching the tree line. The intimacy of the night before still hung in the air like wood smoke, but the man who had held Elara with such desperate tenderness was gone, replaced by the wolf once more. "They're here," he said quietly. Elara rose from the bed, wrapping her shawl tightly around her. She didn't tremble. The fire Silas had sparked in her was stronger than her fear. She picked up the satchel of papers, the evidence that would topple an empire, and looked at him. "We can't win a standoff here, Silas. There are too many of them." Silas turned, his eyes searching hers. He walked over, his heavy boots silent on the floorboards. He took her face in his hands one last time, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "I'm not looking to win a standoff. I'm looking to end a war." They slipped out the back, moving like ghosts through the waist-deep powder. Silas led them to the Black Throat Pass, a narrow, jagged gorge where the mountains seemed to lean in to swallow the sky. It was the only way out, and the only place a single man could hold off an army. As the syndicate gunmen emerged from the tree line, led by the man who had murdered Elara's father, Silas pushed the satchel into Elara's hands. "Take the horse. Head north to the federal outpost in Helena. Don't look back." "Silas, no!" "Go!" he roared, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. "Give them the truth, Elara. Give them the fire. I'll give them the lead." She rode. The wind whipped her hair as she raced across the frozen plateau, the sound of rhythmic gunfire erupting behind her. Each shot felt like a heartbeat being ripped from her chest. She reached the outpost by dusk, her hands frozen to the reins, and collapsed into the arms of the marshals, clutching the papers that would change the history of the West.
3 weeks later, the snow began to melt. The mining syndicate had been dismantled, their leaders in chains, and the Wolf of the Peaks had become a legend, a ghost story told by the men who survived the gorge. Elara stood on the porch of the trading post where it had all begun. She was dressed in fine wool now, the homeless girl a memory. She looked toward the high peaks, her heart heavy with a grief that hadn't faded. Then a shadow moved at the edge of the woods. A massive black horse stepped into the light. The rider was slumped, his furs tattered and stained, but his shoulders were as broad as the mountains themselves. Elara didn't scream, she didn't run. She simply waited as Silas Sterling rode into the center of the camp. He dismounted heavily, his movements pained but certain. He stopped in front of her, the scent of pine and old battles clinging to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single crumpled gold coin, the last of the 50 he had paid for her. He pressed it into her palm, his hand closing over hers. "I told you," he rasped, his voice a low, beautiful growl that made her world go still. "I'm a man who likes to get his money's worth, and I haven't finished my life with you yet." Elara let out a sob of pure, unadulterated joy, throwing her arms around his neck. Silas buried his face in her hair, holding her with a fierce, possessive strength that promised he would never let go again. On the rugged frontier of Montana, the sun finally rose on a peace they had bought with blood, and a love that would be whispered about long after the mountains turned to dust. The Montana summer was a miracle Silas Sterling had never expected to see again. The air in the high meadows was no longer sharp with ice, but sweet with the scent of wild clover and sun-warmed pine. Silas stood on the porch of the cabin, the same cabin that had once been a fortress of loneliness, watching the sun dip behind the peaks. He was shirtless, his skin bronzed by the sun, the scars on his back fading like old memories. He was no longer the wolf. He was a man with a home. He felt the screen door creak open behind him. He didn't have to turn to know it was her. The air changed when Elara entered a space. It became lighter, warmer.
"The bread is cooling," she said, her voice soft. She stepped up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her cheek against his broad, warm shoulder. "You've been out here a long time, Silas. What are you looking for?" Silas turned in her arms, his large hands coming up to cup her face. Elara looked different now. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out, and the flint-like hardness in her eyes had softened into a deep, glowing emerald. "I was just thinking," he rasped, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip, "about the day I bought you for 50 pieces of gold. It was the best bargain I ever struck, but I was a fool." Elara tilted her head, a playful smile touching her lips. "A fool? Why is that?" "Because," he whispered, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers, "because I thought I was saving you. I didn't realize that you were the one who was going to save me." The playfulness faded, replaced by that intense magnetic heat that had defined their first night together. Silas swept her up into his arms, carrying her easily toward the large cedar swing he had built at the end of the porch. He sat down with her in his lap, the chain of the swing creaking rhythmically. The intimacy between them was no longer desperate or frantic, it was deep and anchored. He began to unpin her hair, letting the dark locks fall over his calloused hands like silk. "The marshal sent a letter today," Elara murmured, her eyes fluttering shut as his fingers massaged her scalp. "The valley is safe. The new settlers are calling it Sterling's Pass." Silas let out a low, vibrating hum in his chest. "I don't care about the valley, Elara, and I don't care about the name." He tilted her chin up, his gaze dropping to her mouth with a familiar burning hunger. "I only care that when the snow returns this year, and it will, I won't be shivering, because I'll have you." He leaned in, his kiss slow and deep, tasting of the life they had built together. It was a kiss that promised many more winters, many more summers, and a love that no syndicate, no gunman, and no storm could ever take away. In the quiet of the Montana evening, the mountain man finally had his girl, and the girl finally had her peace. And so, that was the tale of Silas and Elara, a man who didn't just buy a girl, he bought a destiny. But remember, the mountains still hide many secrets, and every secret has its price. If you felt the heat between Silas and Elara, or if their fight for justice moved you, make sure to hit that like button. It helps our stories reach more souls wandering in the cold. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a chapter of our upcoming sagas. I want to hear from you in the comments. Was Silas right to risk everything for a stranger, or was it Elara's fire that truly saved him? Tell me your favorite moment. Our next story is already brewing, and it's going to be even more intense, but I want you to help me choose the path. What kind of mountain man should we meet next? Should it be the grumpy outcast who finds a wounded runaway in his territory, or the silent protector who has to rescue a city girl lost in a deadly blizzard? Drop your vote in the comments below. Stay for the passion, stay for the danger, and stay for the mountains. I'll see you in the next one.